September 10th, 1931. 3:30 in the afternoon. 230 Park Avenue, Manhattan, 9th floor. A man named Salvatore Maranzano sat behind a mahogany desk in a real estate office that had never sold a single property. He wore a tailored suit. He had a gold watch. He had just declared himself the boss of all bosses of the American Mafia. 4 men walked through the door posing as federal agents. They flashed badges. They told the bodyguards to line up against the wall. Then they walked into Maranzano's private office, and they stabbed him 6 times before shooting him twice in the head. He died on his office floor surrounded by fake real estate contracts and a loaded pistol he never got the chance to use. The whole thing took less than 90 seconds. This was not just another mob killing. Maranzano had spent 4 months restructuring the entire American underworld. He divided the Italian criminal gangs of New York into 5 distinct families. He appointed bosses. He set rules. He modeled the whole thing after the Roman Empire because he was obsessed with Julius Caesar. And then, just like Caesar, he got stabbed to death by the men he thought he controlled. The man who ordered the hit was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, 33 years old, a former street kid from the Lower East Side, and the most important gangster in American history. This is the story of how the gangs of New York became the 5 families. Not overnight, not in a single generation. Over the course of 106 years, from 1825 to 1931, a straight line runs from the first Irish street gang to the most powerful criminal empire the world has ever known. From pickpockets to presidents of organized crime, from back-alley brawlers to men who controlled billions of dollars, corrupted governments, and shaped the modern world. But here is what most people get wrong. The 5 families did not appear out of nowhere. They were not imported from Sicily. They were grown right here in the mud and blood and sewage of one tiny neighborhood in Lower Manhattan, a neighborhood called 5 Points. And the story begins with a man most people have never heard of, a man named Edward Coleman. You have to understand what New York looked like in 1825. Manhattan was still half farmland. The city ended around 14th Street, and at its southern tip, where 5 streets came together at a single intersection, there was a neighborhood that would become the most dangerous place in America. The 5 streets were Orange, Cross, Anthony, Little Water, and Mulberry. They met at a point near an old dried-up pond called the Collect Pond. When the city filled in that pond, the ground never fully settled. Buildings sank, basements flooded, sewage pooled in the streets. Nobody with money wanted to live there. So the poorest of the poor moved in, Irish immigrants, fleeing the coming famine. Free black families pushed out of other neighborhoods. A few German and Italian families crammed into tenements that held 10 times the number of people they were built for. This was 5 Points. And out of this misery, the first organized criminal gang in American history was born. Edward Coleman was not what you might expect. While Herbert Asbury, in his famous 1928 book The Gangs of New York, described Coleman as an Irish gang leader, contemporary newspaper accounts from 1838 describe him as a black man. His wife, Anne, was described in press reports as either colored or mulatto. What is not disputed is this: Coleman was charismatic, he was violent, and around 1825 or 1826, he gathered a crew of petty criminals operating out of a grocery store at the corner of Center and Antony Streets. They called themselves the 40 Thieves, likely named after the Ali Baba story. And they became the first known criminal gang with an established leader in New York City history. You know what made the 40 Thieves different from common street criminals? Organization. Before Coleman, crime in 5 Points was freelance. Pickpockets worked alone. Muggers hit whoever was convenient. Coleman changed that. He gave men specific roles. He demanded a cut of every score. He provided protection. He created, for the first time, a structure, a hierarchy. a system where crime paid better when you worked together than when you worked alone. That idea, that simple idea, would survive for 200 years. Coleman's reign did not last long. In 1838, he married a woman named Anne, known around 5 Points as the Pretty Hot Corn Girl. The accounts vary on what happened next. Asbury wrote that Coleman beat her to death because she did not earn enough money, but contemporary newspapers from July of 1838 tell a darker story. They report that Coleman cut his wife's throat with such force that she was nearly decapitated, claiming he killed her because she had been with another man. Either way, Coleman was arrested, convicted of murder, and on January 12, 1839, he became the first man hanged at the newly constructed Tombs prison. The first leader of the first gang in New York was dead, but the machine he built kept running. Here is where it gets interesting. The 40 Thieves did not simply disappear. They fractured, they evolved, and from that fracture came something bigger. In the 1830s, during a meeting of one of the splinter groups, someone threw a dead rabbit into the center of the room. Some of the men took it as an omen. They broke away and formed their own gang. They called themselves the Dead Rabbits. Now, the word dead in this context did not mean lifeless. In Old Irish slang, dead meant very or really. A dead rabbit was a really tough guy. And these men lived up to the name. The Dead Rabbits were Irish to the bone, Catholic, immigrants, or sons of immigrants. They operated out of the same 5 Point streets that the 40 Thieves had controlled, and they allied with the remaining 40 Thieves members, but they had enemies. Across the Bowery, a different kind of gang was forming. Native-born Americans, Protestant, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant. They called themselves the Bowery Boys. Their most famous leader was a man named William Poole, a butcher by trade who went by the name Bill the Butcher. Poole was a bare-knuckle fighter, a nativist enforcer, and one of the most feared men in Manhattan. He believed that America belonged to native-born whites, and he used his fists and his gang to enforce that belief. For decades, the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys tore each other apart. Street brawls, stabbings, beatings in broad daylight. But the worst of it came on July 4th, 1857. What started as a street fight near Bayard Street exploded into a full-scale riot. Dead Rabbits on one side, Bowery Boys on the other, hundreds of men armed with clubs, bricks, knives, and pistols. The fighting spread across multiple blocks. Both the Metropolitan Police and the Municipal Police responded, but the city's two competing police forces were in the middle of their own power struggle and could barely coordinate. By the time the violence ended 2 days later, at least 8 men were dead and over 100 were wounded. Newspapers called it the Dead Rabbits Riot. It was the worst gang violence New York had ever seen. And it was only the beginning. 6 years later, in July of 1863, the New York draft riots tore the city apart. The Bowery Boys were in the thick of it, looting, burning buildings, attacking black residents. The violence lasted 4 days and killed over 100 people. The Union Army had to be called in to restore order, and when the smoke cleared, something had changed. The old gangs were exhausted. The Bowery Boys fractured into smaller groups. The Dead Rabbits faded. The Civil War had drained the energy out of the street-fighting generation. 5 Points was quiet, but not for long. Into that vacuum stepped something new, something worse. In the late 1860s, from the wreckage of the old 5 Points gangs, a new organization emerged. They called themselves the Whyos, named after the bird-like call they used to identify each other on the streets. Whyo. It sounded like an owl. And when you heard it in a dark alley, it meant trouble was coming. The Whyos were different from the Dead Rabbits or the Bowery Boys. Those gangs had ideologies, Irish pride, nativist politics. The Whyos had none of that. They were purely criminal. They victimized everyone, Irish, German, Italian, black, Protestant, Catholic, it did not matter. If you had money, the Whyos would take it. If you had a business, the Whyos would tax it. If you refused, the Whyos would hurt you. And they were very specific about the cost. In 1884, police arrested a Whyos member named Piker Ryan and found a price list on his person. This is real. This is documented. Punching, $1. Both eyes blacked, $3. Nose and jaw broke, $7. Knocked out with a blackjack, $15. Ear chewed off, $15. Leg or arm broke, $19. Shot in the leg, $20. Stabbing, $22. And at the bottom of the list, the most chilling entry of all. Doing the big job, meaning murder, $100 and up. The Whyos were led by two men named Danny Driscoll and Danny Lyons. Together, they ran the gang from the late 1870s through the mid-1880s. They decreed that to be a true Whyo, you had to have killed at least once. Their headquarters moved around, from a saloon on Christie Street to a dive bar called the Morgue, where over 100 men were killed in drunken gunfights over the years. At their peak, the Whyos controlled most of Manhattan. Every other gang had to ask their permission to operate. But here is the thing about building a criminal empire on pure violence. It does not last. Danny Driscoll was arrested for murder and hanged at the Tombs prison on January 23, 1888. Danny Lyons was arrested for a separate murder and hanged at the same prison on August 21st of that same year. Both leaders gone within 8 months. The Whyos never recovered. Without leadership, the members turned on each other. One of their last great moments was a gunfight between two Whyos arguing over shares of a robbery. Over 20 members got involved. Not a single person was hit. The press reported that the bar owner was not surprised, noting that nobody could aim after drinking his liquor. By the early 1890s, a new power was rising. A man named Edward Monk Eastman, a Jewish gangster built like a fire hydrant, who kept a collection of pigeons and cats and carried a huge club wrapped in leather. Eastman demolished what was left of the Whyos and took control of the Lower East Side. But he was not alone. Across the neighborhood, an Italian immigrant was building something even more significant. His name was Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, but he went by Paul Kelly, an Irish name for an Italian man. He chose it deliberately because the Lower East Side was still Irish territory, and an Italian name would have gotten him killed before he got started. Kelly was a former boxer, short, stocky, smart. He ran brothels, he ran gambling dens, and sometime in the 1890s, he organized a collection of Italian, Irish, Jewish, and Polish street criminals into a single multi-ethnic gang. He called them the 5 Points Gang. You have to understand why this mattered. Every gang before Kelly had been tribal. Irish fought for the Irish. Nativists fought for native-born whites. The Whyos were Irish in membership, even if they were criminal in purpose. Kelly broke that mold. He did not care where you came from. He cared about what you could do. And that single decision, that willingness to recruit across ethnic lines, is what turned a street gang into the foundation of the American Mafia. The 5 Points Gang numbered as many as 1,500 members at their peak. They operated out of Kelly's New Brighton Athletic Club, a saloon and dance hall that served as their headquarters, and they had a direct line to the most powerful political organization in New York, Tammany Hall. Here is how the arrangement worked. Tammany Hall politicians needed votes. They needed to win elections. Kelly's 5 Points Gang provided the muscle. They threatened voters at polling stations. They stuffed ballot boxes. They falsified voter registration lists. In return, Tammany Hall protected the gang from police interference. Judges who owed Tammany their careers dismissed charges. Cops looked the other way. It was a system of mutual corruption that worked beautifully for both sides. But Kelly was not the only power on the Lower East Side. Monk Eastman controlled the territory east of the Bowery with his own gang of hundreds. And in 1903, the two forces collided. On a September night, members of the Eastman Gang and the 5 Points Gang squared off on Rivington Street. The gunfight lasted for hours. Hundreds of men firing pistols, swinging clubs, throwing bricks. Police from multiple precincts responded, but could not get close enough to stop the battle. By dawn, multiple men were dead and dozens were wounded. The Battle of Rivington Street was one of the largest gang fights in New York history. After the battle, Tammany Hall stepped in. Big Tim Sullivan, a Tammany boss, brokered a deal. He arranged a boxing match between Kelly and Eastman to settle the dispute. The fight reportedly went on for 2 hours with no clear winner, but Tammany ultimately backed Kelly over Eastman. Monk Eastman was arrested shortly after on an assault charge and sent to prison. With Eastman out of the picture, the 5 Points Gang controlled the Lower East Side. Now here is where the story takes its most important turn. Remember this name, Johnny Torrio. Born Giovanni Torrio in 1882 in southern Italy, raised in New York, and recruited into the 5 Points Gang as a teenager. Torrio was different from the brawlers and street fighters around him. He was quiet, calculating. He did not drink. He did not start fights. But he understood money better than anyone in the gang. Kelly recognized this and made Torrio his right-hand man. Torrio ran the James Street Boys, a crew affiliated with the 5 Points Gang, and he was the first to see that the future of crime was not in street fighting. It was in business. Protection rackets, numbers running, gambling, prostitution. These were reliable income streams. And if you controlled them efficiently, with minimal violence and maximum profit, you could become genuinely wealthy. Torrio did not just participate in organized crime, he invented the concept. Around 1909, Torrio got a call from his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, who ran a network of brothels in Chicago. Colosimo needed help managing his operations. Torrio went, and he took with him everything he had learned from the 5 Points Gang: the organizational structure, the political connections, the business model. He planted the seed of New York's street gang culture in Chicago's soil, and it grew into something monstrous. Before Torrio left New York, he had already noticed a young man hanging around the 5 Points turf, a kid from Brooklyn, tough, fearless, built thick and mean. His name was Alphonse Capone, Al Capone, born in 1899 in Brooklyn to Italian immigrant parents. Capone joined the 5 Points Gang as a teenager, working as a bouncer at a bar where a knife fight earned him the scar that gave him his famous nickname, Scarface. When Torrio needed muscle in Chicago around 1919, he sent for Capone. The kid from Brooklyn went west and never came back. But Capone was not the most important recruit to come out of the 5 Points. That honor belongs to a skinny Sicilian kid from the Lower East Side named Salvatore Lucania. You know him as Lucky Luciano, born November 24th, 1897, in La Cara Friddi, Sicily. His family emigrated to New York when he was 9. By 14, he had dropped out of school and been arrested multiple times. He fell in with the 5 Points Gang and formed a lasting friendship with a young Jewish gangster named Meyer Lansky. Where Capone was a blunt instrument, Luciano was a chess player. He studied the men around him. He learned from their mistakes. And he waited. While Torrio and Capone were building their empire in Chicago, something else was happening in New York. The Sicilian Mafia, a criminal organization that had operated in Sicily for generations, had been sending operatives to America since the 1880s. One of the first was Giuseppe Morello, known as the Clutch Hand because of a deformed right hand. Morello established the first true mafia family in New York and ran counterfeiting operations along with his enforcer Ignazio Lupo, called Lupo the Wolf. These men brought with them the mafia's code, omerta. Silence, hierarchy, blood oaths, respect for the boss. By the 1920s, New York's Italian underworld was dominated by one man, Giuseppe Joe, the boss, Masseria. Masseria controlled the most profitable rackets in the city. He demanded tribute from every Italian gang. He was greedy, he was violent, and he was old school. He believed that the Mafia should be exclusively Sicilian and Italian. No outsiders, no alliances with Jewish or Irish gangsters. Just blood, just family. Then came Prohibition. January 17th, 1920. The 18th Amendment took effect, and the sale of alcohol became illegal across the United States. Overnight, a market worth hundreds of millions of dollars went underground, and the men who controlled that market became fabulously wealthy. Bootlegging transformed American organized crime from a collection of street gangs into a national industry. And the 5 Points alumni were perfectly positioned to profit. Torrio and Capone built the Chicago outfit into a bootlegging empire. Frankie Yale, another 5 Points graduate, controlled beer distribution in Brooklyn. Luciano, working under Masseria, built his own bootlegging network in Manhattan. Meyer Lansky handled the financial operations. Bugsy Siegel provided the muscle. All of them had come up through the same system, the same streets, the same gang. But Masseria's greed was creating problems. He demanded too large a cut from everyone. He started wars he did not need to fight. And in the late 1920s, a challenge came from an unexpected direction. Salvatore Maranzano, sent to America from the Sicilian town of Castellammarese del Golfo, began organizing the Castellammarese faction, Sicilian gangsters who resented Masseria's dominance. By February of 1930, the tension exploded into open war, the Castellammarese War. Masseria fired the first shot. On February 26, 1930, he ordered the murder of Gaetano Reina, boss of what would become the Lucchese family. Reina was shot in the head as he left his aunt's home. A message: fall in line or die, but the message backfired. Reina's men secretly switched their loyalty to Maranzano. The war escalated. On August 15, 1930, Castellammarese loyalists walked into an office at 341 East 116th Street and shot Giuseppe Morello, the old clutch hand, along with another man. Morello, the first Mafia boss in New York, was dead. The killings kept coming. Steve Ferrigno, Al Mineo, Joseph Catania, Joe Aiello in Chicago, ambushed outside a building and hit with over 50 rounds. Bodies piled up on both sides. The war was bleeding the Mafia dry. And the young men, Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, these were the ones paying the price, while the old bosses gave orders from behind closed doors. Luciano saw the opportunity. He was nominally on Masseria's side, but he secretly opened negotiations with Maranzano. The deal was simple. Luciano would arrange Masseria's death. In return, the war would end, and Luciano would inherit Masseria's rackets. Maranzano agreed. On April 15, 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to lunch at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro on Coney Island. They ate. They played cards. At some point, Luciano excused himself to use the bathroom. While he was gone, 4 gunmen walked in. The accounts vary on who exactly pulled the triggers, but the names most commonly cited include Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. Joe, the boss Masseria, took 6 bullets. He died on the restaurant floor, still clutching a playing card, the ace of spades. At least, that is what legend says. The police photograph shows a card near his hand. Whether it was placed there by someone with a sense of drama, nobody knows. With Masseria dead, Maranzano declared victory. He called a massive meeting at a hall in the Bronx. Hundreds of mobsters attended. Maranzano stood at the front and announced a new order. He divided the Italian gangs of New York City into 5 families. He appointed bosses. Luciano would lead one family, Joe Bonanno another, Joseph Profaci a third, Vincent Mangano a fourth, Thomas Gagliano a fifth. These 5 families, reorganized and renamed over the decades, still exist today. Genovese, Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Lucchese. The 5 families. But Maranzano was not finished. He declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He modeled himself after the Roman Caesars, studying ancient texts and believing he was destined to rule. And just like Caesar, his arrogance made him enemies. Within weeks, Luciano learned through his network that Maranzano had hired an Irish gunman named Vincent Mad Dog Coll to murder Luciano, Genovese, and Costello. Luciano was not going to wait. On September 10th, 1931, less than 5 months after Massaria's death, Luciano sent 4 Jewish gangsters provided by Meyer Lansky to Maranzano's office at 230 Park Avenue. Tommy Lucchese, who had been secretly loyal to Luciano, was already inside the building and pointed out Maranzano to the assassins. The men flashed fake federal badges, disarmed the bodyguards, and entered Maranzano's private office. They stabbed him 6 times and shot him twice. The man who had crowned himself boss of all bosses was dead on his floor at the age of 45. But here is what the history books do not tell you. Luciano did not take the title for himself. That was the whole point. He understood something that Massaria and Maranzano never did. The title of boss of all bosses was a death sentence. Every man who held it became a target, so Luciano abolished it. He did not want a throne. He wanted a boardroom. Later in 1931, Luciano called a meeting in Chicago with crime bosses from across the country. He proposed something that had never existed before: a commission, a governing body for the American Mafia. The commission would mediate disputes between families. It would approve or deny hits on bosses. It would divide territory. It would set rules that everyone followed. No more wars, no more chaos. Just business. The original commission comprised the bosses of the 5 families of New York, plus Al Capone from Chicago and Stefano Magaddino from Buffalo. 7 votes, majority rules. It was, in the most grotesque sense of the word, a democracy, and it worked. For 50 years, the commission kept the peace among the most violent men in America. It is often called Luciano's greatest innovation. Think about that for a moment. Stand at the corner of Worth and Baxter Streets today, which used to be Anthony and Orange Streets, the heart of the old 5 Points. Look around. There are government buildings now, a courthouse, clean sidewalks. No trace of what this place was, but everything started here. Edward Coleman formed the 40 Thieves in 1825. On these blocks, a dead rabbit thrown across a meeting room created the Dead Rabbits. Bill the Butcher led the Bowery Boys against them. The Whyos offered murder for $100. Paul Kelly merged the survivors into the 5 Points gang. Johnny Torrio learned how to run a business. Al Capone learned how to fight. Lucky Luciano learned how to think. And on September 10th, 1931, the last remnants of the old street gang era were stabbed and shot in an office on Park Avenue. 106 years. That is how long the transformation took. From Edward Coleman's grocery store to Luciano's commission. From fistfights over stolen wallets to an organization that controlled labor unions, construction, shipping, gambling, narcotics, and politicians from coast to coast. What happened to the rest of them? Johnny Torrio eventually returned to New York and lived quietly until his death in 1957 at the age of 75. He died in a barber's chair, heart attack. Al Capone went to prison for tax evasion in 1931, spent years in Alcatraz, and was released in 1939 with a mind destroyed by untreated syphilis. He died in 1947 at his Florida estate, confused and broken, at the age of 48. Luciano was convicted of running a prostitution ring in 1936 and sentenced to 30 to 50 years. During World War II, the US government made a secret deal with Luciano, using his Mafia connections to secure the New York waterfront and aid the invasion of Sicily. In 1946, his sentence was commuted on the condition he be deported to Italy. He lived in Naples until his death from a heart attack on January 26, 1962. He was 64. Meyer Lansky, the financial genius, was never convicted of a major crime. He died in 1983 at 80 years old. The FBI estimated he had hidden over $300 million in offshore accounts. They never found a dime. And the 5 families? They are still operating. Diminished, yes. Battered by RICO prosecutions in the 1980s and 90s, weakened by informants like Sammy the Bull Gravano, who helped bring down John Gotti in 1992. As recently as the 2020s, FBI wiretaps have picked up conversations between family members discussing rackets, disputes, and money. The commission still exists, though its power is a shadow of what Luciano built. Here is what this story really tells you. The American Mafia was not an Italian import. It was an American invention. It grew out of American poverty, American corruption, American immigration policy, and American prohibition. The Sicilians brought their traditions, their oaths, their code of silence. But the organizational model, the political connections, the multi-ethnic alliances, the business strategy, all of that was born in the mud of 5 points. Every generation learned from the one before. The 40 thieves taught the dead rabbits that organization beats chaos. The dead rabbits taught the Whyos that controlling territory is power. The Whyos taught the 5 Points gang that violence is a product you can sell. The 5 Points gang taught the Mafia that crime works best when it operates like a corporation. Each gang was a draft of the same idea, getting more sophisticated with every version. Edward Coleman never imagined the commission, but without him, it does not exist. Without the dead rabbits, there is no gang warfare to learn from. Without the Whyos, there is no professionalized violence. Without Paul Kelly, there is no multi-ethnic recruitment model. Without Johnny Torrio, there is no business framework. Without Capone and Luciano, there is no national organization. It is a straight line, each group building on the wreckage of the last. You walk through Lower Manhattan today, and there is nothing left. No sign of the 40 thieves. No plaque for the Whyos. Columbus Park sits where the old brewery once stood, the most notorious tenement in 5 Points, where over 1,000 people once lived in a single building. The streets have been renamed. Orange is now Baxter, Cross is now Moscow, Anthony is now Worth. The history has been paved over, but underneath, if you know where to look, the foundations are still there. 200 years ago, a man with a grocery store on the corner of Center and Anthony decided that crime pays better when you work as a team. That idea, passed from gang to gang, generation to generation, evolved into the most powerful criminal organization in history. The 40 thieves became the dead rabbits. The dead rabbits became the Whyos. The Whyos became the 5 Points gang. And the 5 Points gang became the 5 families. That is the real story of the American Mafia. Not imported, homegrown, born in the worst neighborhood in America. Built by men who had nothing and would do anything to get something. A 200-year experiment in organized violence that proved one terrifying truth. Crime does not just pay. When it is organized well enough, it becomes an institution. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Leave a comment below. Tell us, which era of New York's underworld do you think was the most dangerous? The gangs of the 1800s or the 5 families of the 20th century? Drop your take. We read every single one.